If you're a U.S. citizen living overseas and you've stopped filing your U.S. taxes, you're not alone. I see this more often than you'd think. Most people assume that once they leave the country, they're outside the IRS system, and that's just not how it works. What usually happens is nothing, at least not right away, and that's where people get comfortable. But the issue doesn't go away, it builds in the background, and by the time most people decide to deal with it, the situation is more complicated than it needed to be. So I want to walk you through what's actually happening when you stop filing from abroad, how serious it really is, and what you should be thinking about before this turns into something harder to fix. The starting point for almost every one of these situations is the same assumption. People move abroad, start working in another country, and think, I'm not in the US anymore, so I don't have to deal with US taxes. And that's the core mistake. The US taxes system is based upon citizenship, or not just where you live. Even if you're living overseas full-time, the filing obligation is still there. Usually what happens is that they realize this when they try to refinance a mortgage back home, or they need to show US tax compliance for something, and it hits them all at once. The reason this goes on for so long is because nothing obvious happens right away. The IRS doesn't immediately come after someone just because they missed a return while living abroad, so from the outside it feels like everything is fine. But what's actually happening is the problem is building quietly. Multiple years of missing filings, income that hasn't been reported, accounts or financial activity that should have been disclosed. None of that resolves itself just because time passes. Early on, most of these cases are very manageable. But as time goes on, it's not just about money, it's about control. There's a big difference between someone who comes in after 2 or 3 years versus someone who waited a decade. The person who comes in early, we usually have a clean path. Options are open. The people who waited, same underlying situation, but now we're dealing with layers of complexity that didn't need to be there. More years, more accounts, more variables. It's still fixable, but the margin for error gets tighter. If there's one concept that really matters here, it's timing. Before the IRS gets involved, you generally have more flexibility and more control over how things are handled. Once the IRS steps in, your options narrow. The process becomes reactive instead of strategic. And a lot of people tell themselves, I'll deal with this later when I have more time. But later usually means fewer options. If you're living abroad and you've missed a few years and you're not sure how exposed you are, the biggest mistake I see is people guessing or waiting too long before getting clarity. If you want help with that, you can book a call using the link in the description. So what should you actually do if you're in this situation? The first step is to not panic, and it's not to start filing things blindly. The first step is understanding where you actually stand, how many years, what kind of income or accounts, what the overall picture looks like. This is not just a filing issue, it's a strategy issue. Different situations are handled differently depending upon the facts. I've seen people try to fix this themselves and file amended returns for years they were never even required to file, which actually created new problems. And that's what happens when you skip the strategy step. The important thing to understand is that most of these situations are fixable. The outcome depends on how early you address it, how accurately it's handled, and whether there's a clear strategy behind what you're doing. The goal is to take control of it before it becomes more complicated than it needs to be. If you're living abroad and you've fallen behind on filings, the situation isn't about panic, it's about how you handle it from there. When people run into real problems is when this goes on for years without being addressed. So in the next video, I'll walk you through what actually happens when someone hasn't filed taxes for 10 years or more, and what it looks like when you finally decide to deal with it.